I want to talk now about what Chapter 8 of the course text, The Craft of Research, says about making a claim statement and combine that with Chapter 16. Chapter 8 focuses just on a claim statement, which is another name for a thesis statement or an executive summary or an abstract or a summary lead or a statement of the major themes. The claim statement is a summary of what your document will prove. The word claim indicates that the statement needs to be proved, and after you make the claim statement, you will provide evidence to prove the claim statement. In an academic setting, a claim statement is typically called a thesis statement. The textbook prefers the more general term claim statement to refer to different disciplines. Chapter 16 takes the claim statement and shows how to expand it in a professional introduction. The introduction adds other elements to the claim statement, such as a summary of evidence or a summary of the methodology, or elements that identify the consequences of the claim statement in order to justify why the reader should spend time reading the document. Chapter 8 thus explains the claim statement. Chapter 16 explains how the introduction incorporates the claim statement. I'm doing a session to combine those two. These two chapters are key to professional writing, and they're key to writing the assignments in this course. The claim statement answers the research problem and the research questions, usually in a conclusive way, saying there is an answer rather than saying there's no answer. So, for example, in 2002, the intelligence services of the United States and other countries had to answer the question, does Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? That was the research problem. That was the research question. The answer to the question was important because the answer would determine whether or not to take military action. If the intelligence agency said there was no answer, then that would be a problem. That would not support any military action. No answer would mean no ability to decide to take action against what could be a serious threat. You can't invade a country and cause the deaths of people if you don't have a reason for the invasion. The situation would be the same if a doctor wants to operate on a patient. The doctor should have a reason for operating. In the case of Iraq, the intelligence agencies understood the importance of giving a conclusive answer. A conclusive answer would lead to a conclusive decision of what action to take. It was a prediction. And instead of giving a probability statistic in the analysis of the situation, say there's a 60% chance that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, the analysts were confident that the probability of being correct was absolute or 100% to justify invasion. The result was that no weapons of mass destruction were found. The analysis released to the public in 2002 before the invasion said, quote, "We judge that Iraq has continued its weapons of mass destruction programs in defiance of UN resolutions and restrictions. Baghdad has chemical and biological weapons as well as missiles with ranges in excess of UN restrictions. If left unchecked, it will probably have a nuclear weapons during this decade," end quote. So that was the wording, the thesis statement, the claim statement of the intelligence services in their analysis of the situation. And it was so conclusive, so absolute, that it justified an invasion that cost lives and was very expensive. So that's a demonstration of serious consequences to an important claim statement. The chapter on claim statements says to start your research with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a provisional claim statement or a provisional thesis statement. I've been calling it your working hypothesis. A good introduction is a summary that makes it worth the while of the reader to read your document and makes it easy to understand the purpose and meaning of the document to come. You need to convince your readers that the problem is worth solving, and that's part of the purpose of your introduction. And this is why you will give the context, you will, in the introduction. In the introduction, you are saying that you have a definite solution, and you're promising to give that definite solution, and your thesis statement is a summary of your definite solution. You are not waiting until the conclusion to tell your reader what your solution is. You tell your solution or conclusion in the beginning in the thesis statement. Now, the text says that you should anticipate a skeptical reader and anticipate questions of a skeptical reader and answer those questions in advance. And a fundamental question of the skeptical reader is, why should I care? Why should I care about reading this document? Why should I care about the thesis statement? And as the text says, it's going to be a big obstacle for you if your answer to why you care, the response is, oh, you haven't persuaded me, I don't care. Now, it's easy to lose that important orientation in doing an assignment for a course. A student may assume that he or she doesn't need to convince the marker of the assignment that the problem is worth solving, or that the marker will say, why should I care? But the text is warning you that if you learn only to do assignments without these elements, you're not prepared for the real world. So you're being marked in this course on these elements in the text and the lectures. And so even though you may see yourself as doing an assignment for one marker, the marker is looking for you to persuade him or her. Now, for the structure of the introduction, which I dealt with previously, and just let me review it here, is the underlying structure in professional work research tends to be the same from different disciplines. There's a shared format, and I gave those shared formats previously. And typical of the shared format in the introduction is contextualized background. And that background is relevant to your thesis statement, and it's often intriguing, going to intrigue the reader. There will be a statement of the research problem. There will be a statement of the response to the research problem, which is the claim statement. And that response in the introduction can summarize what the logic or data will show. So the format, a really generic format for this would be context, problem, response. The response is the claim statement. The length of that introduction will be proportional to the size of the document. That is, a long document, say 100 pages, will have a longer introduction, say a page or two. For assignments in this course, which assignments are 500 words long, a proportional introduction would be 1 to 3 sentences. So pretty much your thesis statement. The text calls this kind of format the grammar of the introduction and says that it satisfies the expectations of being professional for a professional audience. All this may seem formulaic to you, but that's what the readers expect, the text says. If you don't use this format or grammar, you may lose credibility for being professional. So the context. Examples of introductions in the text are set up as intriguing problems which the claim statement or thesis statement in the introduction answers. The idea that the problem is intriguing is giving an incentive for the reader to read the document. For example, one sample introduction starts with fiction, science fiction, which is apparently an innocent and uncontroversial way to begin an introduction. And in a sense, this innocent-seeming introduction in the text that refers to science fiction, it lures the reader into the paragraph like you hook a fish first and then you reel the fish in. Immediately after this sample introduction related to science fiction, the example in the text immediately relates it to important social issue. The issue of norms in gender and ethnicity, destructive stereotypes, and human rights. So, although we start in the sample with something that seems innocuous, science fiction, the issue is very serious to society. The issue of norms in gender and ethnicity, destructive stereotypes, and human rights. And the question proposed, the research problem proposed is, does this science fiction, quote, tacitly reinforce destructive stereotypes of what it means to be normal? So very quickly in that sample introduction, we're going to the innocuous issue of fiction and science fiction, but the research problem that's emerging is one that's important for us to discuss at a society. What does it mean to be normal? And if society proposes a stereotype of being normal, is that destructive? Does that force people who are outside the bounds of this norm to be non-existent or to be punished or to be ridiculed? That's a really important social issue. One philosopher who's discussed that is the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who asks, what does it mean to be abnormal? And what kind of power is exercised in claiming somebody is abnormal? So Foucault would say mental patients were declared abnormal in one point in history and segregated from society, whereas before that time, they would have been tolerated as part of society or even seemed to have some kind of divine connection. For example, Socrates in ancient Athens claimed to hear a voice in his head and claimed that he had a divine mission. But at Socrates' time, society might not have judged that to be abnormal, and the insane asylums didn't exist, and so Socrates wasn't segregated. So thus, fiction is not so innocent. Fiction is not so innocuous. Fiction can be a reflection of serious biases and human rights issues in a society. And the sample introduction in the text ends with a highly critical and explosive claim that the norms of Western culture, quote, exclude most of the people in the world. Think of that. This claim, this thesis statement that norms in Western culture exclude most of the people in the world, end quote. Thus, the apparently harmless fictions of Western culture embody bias and prejudiced norms in Western society. The consequence of that is that the norms make bias and prejudice acceptable and invisible. Think of Nazi Germany and the destructive norms and stereotypes. Think of the norm of white Caucasians and now a word we're hearing a lot, white boys. In the United States, we just heard that the Canadian government is going to outlaw white boys in Canada, identify them as a terrorist group. So the problem there is that those who do not fit the norm can be excluded, discriminated against, and exterminated as violations of the norm. So think of that. This example from the text of an introduction is starting with something that seems innocuous, a discussion of the issue of fiction and science fiction, and very quickly moves to a thesis statement that is loaded with consequences, serious consequences that need to be discussed and examined and analyzed in Western culture, even if they are in fiction. So after having said that and spent some time on a few words in the text, you might be now thinking, can you ever again watch science fiction for pleasure, watch a film or a novel? Or are you going to start examining science fiction in this more serious way? Is pleasure harmless? Is pleasure, entertainment, and recreation harmless? We could, for example, start to examine Western science fiction films in the 1950s. When we start to examine those films are preoccupied with alien invaders who looked like Westerners but were lizards, monsters, and devils. Why did that kind of fear work so well on audiences? Well, anyway, the point here I'm making is taking that example from the text and showing how the example catches our interest in an innocuous way and then very quickly leads us into a thesis statement that has important consequences. And that answers the question that the text poses: why should a reader care? Why should a reader care about an essay on science fiction? The answer to the question in the text is the implications. So, for example, the implications in the example of hidden racism in the norms and stereotypes of entertainment and the consequences of that hidden racism. Note that the importance lies in the implications and the consequences, which Chapter 8 spends some time examining. And I've talked previously about the importance of identifying implications and consequences and making sure they're not hidden. If the implications and the consequences are not stated, then the document loses importance. The document gains importance by the importance of the implications and consequences. So you want to make sure that when you're writing an assignment, you identify the implications and consequences of your thesis statement. If you are analyzing another document, say a research document, you want to make sure that the implications and consequences of a thesis statement in that document are identified. Now, as the text explains, the implications and consequences can be an area of dispute. That is, a document yours or a document you're analyzing can be refuted by disagreeing with the implications and consequences. So when you analyze a document, you want to identify the implications and consequences. When you prepare your own document, you want to check that the implications and consequences are identified. Now we have I'm going to continue with the example from the text of fiction, and fiction sometimes satirizes stereotypes in order to ridicule them. That is, in order to turn the audience against the stereotypes. But it may be a flaw of satire that some people may believe the stereotypes to be true and may not see the satire. So the U.S. Is going through some problems right now, political and social and cultural, in dealing with stereotypes of some groups that have become deeply embedded in these groups and are leading to divisions in the country, which even things as apparently harmless as science fiction or Twitter accounts or jokes can carry those destructive elements. So I've given an example from the text of an introduction that opens up into a highly controversial issue. The text gives an example of how to introduce elements in the introduction. It gives an example of referring to previous research, beginning with previous research, only to disrupt the research and disrupt the reader by claiming that the previous research is false. This disruption that the text talks about creates a kind of intriguing intellectual drama. That is, the introduction starts innocuously with a few sentences of a typical belief in research or in science, and then flips that very quickly for the audience and disrupts it. And that's an attempt to hook the reader. So one strategy that the text talks about is establishing a shared common ground between the author and the audience. An example of that would be the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. Okay? Little Red Riding Hood, as a fairy tale, begins innocently. It's a little girl. There's no controversy. She seems to live in an innocent, unfrightening world that we all share, and that's reeling the reader in like a fish. And then we have the disruption of that world, disruption of the familiar shared world with a problem. And the text describes this as exposing the ignorance of the audience in a gentle way. The introduction is saying, in essence, your knowledge to the reader, your knowledge is flawed or incomplete. And romance films often begin gently in this way with a romantic problem that slowly develops into crisis. In the story, fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood, the disruption is that the big bad wolf has killed the grandmother of the girl. The little girl is on the way through the woods to spend some time with her grandmother, and that's a fairly innocuous situation. What she doesn't know is that the big bad wolf has killed the grandmother and is pretending to be the grandmother. And of course, the reader is made aware of that, but the Little Red Riding Hood isn't. And so we have this disruption in the audience as the audience enters into this story. So what the text says is the disruption could be previous flawed research, or the disruption could be a previous misunderstanding, knowledge that we have accepted as fact, and we're now told that is false. Or the disruption could be a misunderstanding of a basic problem. What the text tells us is that some introductions begin abruptly with the problem, and that's a familiar literary technique of what's called beginning in medias res, or beginning in the media, in the middle. Films often do this. The beginning of a film throws the audience into the midst of a crisis. Action adventure films often begin this way. Some films even begin with the ending crisis, and then the film takes us back in problem. Now that we are intrigued, the film narrative takes us back in time by telling us how we got to this problem. The text gives the example of an introduction that begins by telling us that a scientific belief we think is true is not. The example the text uses is telling us that we're wrong to think that hydrofluorocarbons are the chief cause of the depletion of the Earth's ozone layer. So what the text is telling us is that's a really good way to intrigue your audience. You give them a situation the audience believes is true, then you disrupt the audience. You disrupt the knowledge of the audience. And that way you hope to capture the audience. Now, this strategy that the text is giving us, and it's typical for professional writing and for a course like this, is contrary to what we think of as narrative and storytelling. That is, we've been reading stories all our lives, we've been telling stories all our lives, and it's natural for us to tell a story as a narrative. In professional writing, we don't tell a story as a narrative. We use what's called a discursive film, which basically means it's organized in terms of reason and transparency. So think of the difference between a piece of professional writing and a detective novel. Typically, a detective novel begins with a mystery, which is a research problem for the detective to solve, and involves the reader in a game of wits along with the detective. You know, somebody's been murdered. Who is the guilty person amongst all the suspects? What is the evidence? Where does the evidence lead us to the guilty person? Are there those who look guilty who are actually innocent? Is someone who looks innocent actually guilty? How will the detective solve the problem? And the game with the reader is, can the reader solve the problem before the detective? So that's a typical narrative, and we typically tell stories that way, not in professional writing. The difference in professional writing is you begin with the solution. It's not that kind of game of wits in a detective novel where you don't tell the reader the answer to the research problem until the very end. You give the solution to your reader at the beginning in your thesis statement, and then the game of wits with your reader is, do you now muster the evidence to prove your thesis statement? And so the audience is matching wits with you, judging your reasons, judging your evidence, maybe coming up with other ideas to see whether you can be outwitted, or will you just be so convincing, so competent, so professional that the reader can't find any flaws in your argument and agrees to accept your thesis statement. Now, the difference between readers of a detective novel and a research audience is that a research audience loves a good intellectual problem, just like readers of detective novels want a good mystery. So you want to give your research audience the kind of intellectual problem that will intrigue the researchers. And as the text says, you will capture the interest of this audience when you disrupt the thinking of the audience. The text talks about the research problem and divides the research problem into two parts. The research problem can be a condition of incomplete knowledge or incomplete understanding. And so what you're proposing is you identify incomplete knowledge in your thesis statement, and you provide the solution to filling that incomplete knowledge. So you identify perhaps a gap in knowledge. In the business world, this would be the market opportunity or the business gap. You find that there is a part of the market that is not being served at all. Nobody is selling to that market. And so you identify it and you explain why this would be a profitable business venture with evidence to fill this market gap. And the text talks a lot about consequences. So the consequences, you would give if you're focusing on a gap of knowledge, the consequences are what makes the gap in knowledge important. That's what makes the problem important and what makes the research important. The consequence are the answer to the text asks so much. So what? Why should somebody care? The consequences answer that question. The text notes that readers are more motivated by consequences that are a cost rather than a benefit or a reward. That is, the consequences in your thesis statement will solve a problem of cost or solve a problem of benefit. But the text is saying that readers are more motivated by cost than benefit, particularly if they think they are losing money or losing an opportunity. And although the text doesn't get into this, there's actually a really interesting area of research in economics called behavioral economics. And research in behavioral economics has been able to demonstrate what's called risk aversion. That is, people are more averse to the risk of losing what they already have. People are averse to the risk of losing what they already have. And behavioral economists conclude that a penalty is a stronger motivation than a reward. Let me give you a really good example right now. The Canadian government has just announced that because of the new strains of the coronavirus, there will be a penalty for delaying returning to Canada. And the penalty is that the government is now implementing is that if you stay outside of Canada, when you come into Canada, you're going to have to quarantine in a hotel for several days at your own expense, perhaps to $2,000. And so what this is a cost. It's trying to motivate people. Rather than the Canadian government saying, we're going to pass a law that says you can't return to the country, even if you're a citizen, that might be politically difficult to implement. The Canadian government is introducing a penalty to vacationing outside of Canada during the coronavirus pandemic, vacation outside the country, and then the risk of bringing the virus back into Canada or bringing this new variant back into Canada. And that's kind of evidence of how people are motivated by cost and by penalty. The government could have tried to motivate people with a benefit that is come back to Canada and we'll give you a reward or something. That would have cost money. But anyway, the point is that penalty is being used to motivate people. I've had the same experience in teaching when I offered students in other courses both a reward or a bonus mark for submitting an assignment early or penalty marks for submitting an assignment later. And so I've done both things, and sometimes done both things in one course. That is, if students submit an assignment 3 days early before the deadline, I gave them 5 bonus marks. If they're late, I gave a penalty mark. And the idea was to motivate students to plan better and submit assignments before the deadline. Well, the reward did not work. The penalty had more effect than the reward. What I discovered was that students wouldn't submit an assignment early for bonus marks, but students were motivated by a penalty mark to submit an assignment on time. So all that seems to confirm what the text says, that when you're trying to motivate your audience is likely to be risk averse and they'll be more interested in consequences that are not a benefit but are a cost to them. The text is saying that readers take this kind of problem seriously, so you tell them the consequences of the problem, and you tell them consequences of not dealing with the problem in a cost-benefit analysis, which the text talks about. So the text uses a specific example of this. The text talks about applied research in the plan of a city government to increase its tax base by annexing a development. So that is applied research problem. And the idea is that the claim or the working hypothesis of the city government is that if it expands the boundaries of the city, it increases its tax base. If it annexes area just outside of town, it increases its tax basis, and that those increased taxes are a benefit in revenue to the city. And as an example, And that would lead in a typical professional situation, that would lead to a cost-benefit analysis. An example from the text, the city assumed that the annexation would increase revenue by adding more taxpayers. As the text explains, the problem is the assumption is wrong because the city assumed just the increase of taxes without investigating the increase of costs to the city. So instead of doing a full cost-benefit analysis, in this example, the city only did a benefit analysis. It did not examine the costs of annexing. The costs of annexing would, which were just ignored in this example, would increase the cost to the city and much more than the city assumes. So if the city expands its taxation basis, it gets more tax revenue, but that is canceled out by the costs. In terms of pure research, and the text makes a distinction between pure and applied research. Pure research tends to be on theoretical issues that we don't see immediate application, and practical research is research where there are consequences right away. And as the text explains, there could be consequences in that you propose. There could be consequences in the cost of misunderstanding, or there could be a benefit in better understanding. So, for example, let's relate that to an early example I used from the text, the science fiction novel, and an examination of how stereotypes and norms, as pertaining to science fiction, can reflect a larger problem in society of racism and sexism and norms that are punitive and exclusive. So you could argue in the introduction to that scientific that's the article examining science fiction, that there's a cost of misunderstanding how destructive norms can be, and there's a benefit in understanding that issue, and that those consequences then become an argument for reading this analysis of science fiction. And in assignments in this course, you'll see different opportunities. In some cases, it might be a pure research problem. In some cases, it might be a practical research problem. And if you apply the text, if you have a pure research problem, you can increase its value by pointing out some serious consequences. The chapters that I'm examining now talk about testing the consequences, and so the example used by the text is the company that has no data on a certain issue. The consequence of having no data is that the company has no rational way to solve its problem. No data, no solutions. Thus, we identify the consequences. And the point the text is trying to make is that you have to convince the readers of the significance of the research problem. You have to hook your reader. It's not like when you're doing a university assignment, when you assume that your reader, the instructor, is going to mark your assignment, And you think, therefore, well, I don't need to spend much effort convincing the instructor to read the document. Well, we're actually looking at a situation now and professional reports where you do have to consider that. And so that is explored in the text, and it becomes part of what you're marked for in this course. That is your ability to show that you can interest an audience by identifying the consequences. The text also indicates that you have to find or create the audience. And again, that's different from the environment you're doing assignments at a university. When you're doing an assignment in a course, for that assignment, you don't have to create an audience. You don't have to intrigue an audience. You don't have to gather an audience. Your audience, the instructor, is already fixed. And what the text is telling us, you actually need to develop that capacity. Don't simply assume the audience simply exists for you. And that's a real problem in business, in different disciplines. For example, if you're in tourism and you create a tourism website, you are assuming that the audience exists for that website and will find the website. And in the real world, you have to create the audience. You have to find the audience. You have to find the forum for the audience, or you create the forum for the audience. You create the way that draws the audience. In established disciplines, the forums already exist. So if you're in a discipline, there will be professional journals for that discipline. There will be an association with a website, or there may be an independent aggregator online that collects the audience for you. So typically in professional contexts, academic contexts, the forums are already developed. Somebody's already published in the journal. Whereas, say, in a business context, the audience may exist. So in business, Forbes is a business magazine. Bloomberg is a business information provider. Those forums already exist, but you may also need to create your own forum, or create your own group, or create your own publication, or create your own website. And that involves a lot more work. And part of the work of that is finding and creating the audience, which the text is talking about. That creating your own audience, creating your own forum is labor intensive. It's so time consuming to create and maintain the forum that you may not have much time left for contributing to it. Once you create the forum, you have to find a way to attract and build an audience. You can't assume just because you build a forum online that people will gravitate for us. In the media business, this is known as discoverability. That is, what conditions do you create for your message to be discovered? But in most disciplines, the forum is already created, your audience is created, and so your task is to use the forum that exists to create the specific audience for your specific problem. And often there's a gatekeeper for that, that you have to convince to let you in the gate, let you in the publication, typically the editor or the editor-in-chief, and you have to convince first that gatekeeper, the editor, that the problem is important, and it's important to the audience in the forum, And once you convince the gatekeeper, the editor, the gatekeeper lets you in, lets you publish. And the gatekeeper is was the gatekeeper going to look? The gatekeeper is going to look in your introduction. The gatekeeper is going to look, what's your thesis statement? What's your research problem? What are the consequences? Why this is important? Why should people care? All that's contained in the introduction and the thesis statement. And you can see now what, an art and skill the introduction and thesis statement are, and why it often takes so much work to accomplish those things. I've described a difference between the narrative of a science fiction novel or the narrative of a romance novel and the type of discursive writing you do in professional writing for a specific audience, a discipline, an audience that has ideas about what are legitimate research problems worthy of their time and what aren't. And you need to be precise and to capture that audience. And the text has a lot of good advice for you of how you capture that audience. Basically, the text says, open with a striking fact that's relevant to your problem, or open with a relevant anecdote, but be careful that anecdote is not relevant for the audience. Make it a relevant audience, and then you the text advises you disrupt your audience in some way. You deliver a thesis statement, and you answer the question, so what? Why should I care about the thesis statement? By showing the consequences of having or not having the knowledge of the thesis statement, or having or not having applying it. A couple of errors you want to avoid in assignments and professional writing is don't waste time repeating the language of the assignment word for word. That is, if you must paraphrase and summarize or mention key terms and concepts, don't slow down and delay getting to the thesis statement. Another don't start with a dictionary definition. Dictionary definitions are not precise or professional enough. They're too vague. Also, don't start too grandly, the text advises. You're not writing the Game of Thrones, or you're not writing War and Peace, or you're not writing Gone with the Wind. Don't begin, the text says, with an inflated introduction, a sort of arrogant, egotistical introduction. Stick to the ground, stick to something that is rational and clear and well argued.